Washington, few aspects of Joseph R. Biden Jr.'s presidential campaign are shrouded in as much secrecy as the counsel he receives on the economy, which advisors have the most sway with the presumptive Democratic nominee, what ideas have the greatest currency, and what new policies Mr. Biden will ultimately embrace to address the racial inequities now animating protests nationwide.
Some broad contours have become clear. Mr. Biden plays down concerns about the deficit during this recession, aides say, and he has begun soliciting ambitious plans to bridge the gap in earnings and wealth between black and white Americans. His regular briefings are by a small group of liberal economists and others with roots in the Obama White House and Hillary Clinton's 2016 campaign. And he sees the economic recovery as his foremost duty if he wins the presidency.
Yet the details of the policymaking process are closely held. Mr. Biden is now seeking input from more than 100 left-leaning economists and other researchers, but there is little clarity on who has true influence. The Biden campaign recently formed an economic policy committee, which includes these outside experts, and imposed strict rules to ensure their public silence. A 3-page document, sent last month ahead of the committee's first online meeting, warned participants not to circulate email from committee leaders or refer to the candidate or to the campaign in documents.
You are not to disclose the names of others who are involved in the committee to non-members, according to the memo, which has not previously been reported.
Members were allowed to tell friends and colleagues that they are participating, it continued, but you should not, however, disclose your participation on social media such as Facebook or LinkedIn or in your professional bio.
A section about press inquiries began, simply put, do not talk to the press.
Mr. Biden's team of advisors, and how it is shaping the thus far cautious evolution of Mr. Biden's platform toward what aides say will be a more ambitious agenda, is crucial to understanding how Mr. Biden would attempt to govern at a time of persistent economic turmoil, as the nation claws its way out of the depths of the coronavirus recession.
Those advisors are also a key to how he may try to bridge divides between his center-left outlook and the views of young, progressive activists who want him to embrace a bolder agenda of taxing the rich and spending heavily on social programs.
President Trump, Mr. Biden's opponent, has an in-house team of White House advisors but also consults with a wide range of Wall Street executives and other friends, typically with no public disclosure of who they are or what is said.
The confidentiality of Mr. Biden's process drew fire from a top White House aide, who complains that the secrecy allows Mr. Biden's advisors to avoid scrutiny for their views and to champion Mr. Biden publicly without disclosing ties to his campaign.
Conversations with policy experts close to the Biden campaign suggest that Mr. Biden has thus far leaned on a core group of advisors who roughly match his own ideological standing within a Democratic Party that has steadily moved left since Barack Obama won the White House in 2008. Mr. Biden appears to have widened that group to include some of the young and sharply progressive thinkers who drove the policy debate leftward during much of the 2020 Democratic primary campaign.
To wit, asked over email if he was advising Mr. Biden, Gabriel Zuckman, one of the architects of Senator Elizabeth Warren's proposed tax on high-wealth Americans, referred a reporter to an email address for Mr. Biden's press office. That address matched one that campaign officials sent to members of the newly formed Economic Policy Committee, with instructions to give it to reporters in the event of questions about Mr. Biden.
Campaign officials refused multiple requests to detail Mr. Biden's economic brain trust. They did confirm that Mr. Biden receives regular briefings from a group of advisors that includes at least 3 liberal economists who are firmly rooted in the party's Washington establishment, Jared Bernstein and Ben Harris, 2 former chief economists for Mr. Biden from his time in the White House, and Heather Boschee, who was the top economist for Mrs. Clinton's transition team when she was the Democratic nominee in 2016.
The campaign has also announced a set of so-called unity task forces on policy that include appointees by Mr. Biden and Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont, another progressive rival in the Democratic primary race. Those committees have only just begun to meet, and their members have also been instructed not to talk to reporters about their work for the campaign. It is unclear what direct access Mr. Sanders's appointees have to Mr. Biden.
Mr. Biden has faced pressure from progressives who have objected to his receiving advice from Lawrence Summers, a former Treasury Secretary under President Bill Clinton and top economic aide to Mr. Obama, whom they fault over his record in areas like financial regulation and climate change.
Waleed Shahid, a spokesman for Justice Democrats, a progressive group, warned against relying on what he described as the old guard of Democratic economists.
I think people are looking for Biden to make some commitments and show that there's a new generation of progressive economists and thinkers who are surrounding him, Mr. Shahid said, and not the usual suspects in the Democratic Party.
Kevin Hassett, a senior advisor to Mr. Trump and a former chairman of the White House Council of Economic Advisers, said Mr. Biden was allowing economists to hide their ties to him when appearing on television to discuss policy, enabling them to avoid questions about Mr. Biden's campaign and parrot his talking points without disclosure to viewers.
It is unethical to formally advise a candidate and publicly advocate the candidate's views while concealing that relationship, said Mr. Hassett, who worked on the presidential campaigns of John McCain, George W. Bush and Mitt Romney. If he does have an economic team, then he should identify them. If he doesn't identify them, then the advisors should, at the very least, identify themselves as Biden supporters when appearing in the media.
Mr. Biden's campaign responded to questions about his economic team and transparency by taking a shot at Mr. Trump's own record of public disclosure and management of the economy.
Dr. Hassett and his boss should both spend less time griping over cable news coverage and more time trying to fix this mess they got us into, said Andrew Bates, a Biden spokesman. If they want to talk about transparency, they can feel free to release Donald Trump's tax returns any day.
Mr. Biden is briefed regularly by internal and outside advisors on economic issues, an effort that gained urgency amid the pandemic recession. Mr. Biden, people who have been involved in those briefings say, demands detailed presentations and often pushes back on what he has presented. As the pandemic worsened and businesses shut down in response, he has become more fixated on questions of how to preserve business dynamism and to accelerate job creation in recovery.
Campaign officials have stressed to reporters that Mr. Biden is seeking bolder and more expansive solutions to the challenges now facing a nation just beginning to climb out of a steep and swift recession. That almost certainly means adopting at least some of the more aggressive and expensive federal spending programs that progressives have championed.
Of late, Mr. Biden and his team have been discussing additional policies to address long-standing racial and ethnic disparities in income and wealth, on top of the plans he has already rolled out.
The new effort to solicit advice from hundreds of experts is coordinated by Lawrence E. Strickling, a former Commerce Department official under Mr. Obama, who ran a similar effort for the former Democratic presidential candidate Pete Buttigieg. It includes 4 co-chairs, Ms. Boshi, Austin Goolsbee, a former top Obama aide, Byron Auguste, a former National Economic Council deputy under Mr. Obama, and Indivar Dutta Gupta, the co-executive director at the Georgetown Center on Poverty and Inequality and the youngest of the group's leaders.
Mr. Harris, one of the former chief economists for Mr. Biden in the White House, who is 42, appears to be the youngest of the economists in Mr. Biden's inner circle. 2 of the others in that core group, Mr. Bernstein and Ms. Boshi, have spent years in Washington pushing for aggressive federal efforts to boost workers and combat inequality, including raising the minimum wage and providing government-funded paid leave and child care.
They have gained clout as liberal economists moved away from the economic principles espoused by Mr. Clinton, like minimizing government regulation of financial markets, negotiating international trade agreements and reducing the federal budget deficit, that many of Mr. Obama's advisors also embraced.
They are often joined by Ron Klain, a former chief of staff to Mr. Biden, and 2 Biden campaign aides, Steph Feldman, the campaign's policy director, and Jake Sullivan, a senior advisor who served as a gatekeeper of sorts for Mrs. Clinton's campaign policy operation and performs a similar role for Mr. Biden.
Mr. Biden talks to some policy experts who came to prominence under Mr. Clinton, like Mr. Summers and Gene Sperling, and the investment banker Roger C. Altman. Campaign officials have sought to play down Mr. Summers' influence with Mr. Biden.
Mr. Summers declined a request for comment. None of the people contacted by the New York Times who regularly consult with Mr. Biden on economics would agree to speak on the record about the advice they are giving Mr. Biden or the questions he asks about policy matters.
Such refusal tracks with the guidance sent to the members of Mr. Biden's new policy committee.
You are welcome to express yourself in blog or social media posts, letters to the editor, eds, emails, etc., the memo said. You may identify yourself as a volunteer or supporter of the campaign but make clear that the views you express are your own.
The advisors, it added, should not refer to themselves as a policy committee member. They were not to refer to the policy committee at all.